CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Jamie Owen. Welcome to the programme. Our top stories. No truce in sight as 5 days of rocket fire between Israel and the Islamic Jihad in Gaza leaves at least 33 Palestinians and 1 Israeli dead. Our other headlines: Russia says it's withdrawn from areas around Bakhmut to gain defensive advantage. Meanwhile, Ukraine's president is in Rome for talks. Turkey's on the eve of knife-edge elections as leaders make their final pitches before voting begins. And Spain announces emergency relief funds as extreme weather causes water shortages. 2 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli defense forces in a raid on a refugee camp in the occupied West Bank as clashes erupted amid the recent escalation of violence in the region. This comes as Israeli airstrikes on Gaza entered their 5th day. The Palestinian Islamic Jihad group in Gaza says it's pressing on with rocket attacks and has prepared itself for months of confrontation. Both sides have ruled out an immediate truce. At least 33 Palestinians and 1 Israeli have been killed in the violence over the past 5 days. Our correspondent Stephanie Freed in Tel Aviv has the latest on those clashes.
Strikes, according to the military, Israel's military, around 400 strikes, airstrikes on Gaza since the start of this operation, Israel's self-declared operation several days ago. And the death toll there in Gaza, dozens have been killed. More than 100 have been injured in those strikes. You know, you're seeing the scenes behind me. This is Tel Aviv. Stark contrast to the scenes that you'll be seeing in Gaza. Certainly today. On the Israeli side, you have 1 person so far who's been killed, several dozen have been injured, and more than 1,000 rockets and mortars have been launched on Israel's cities. So this is ongoing. It's fluid. Within the past few hours, there's been another volley of rocket fire that's come from Gaza, another round of airstrikes on the part of Israel's military or air forces, because this is fighter jet strikes. This is also drone strikes. This is attack helicopter strikes. So it's a number of different methods that Israel is using. So right now this continues, and the people are talking about ceasefire. Not sure.
What are the chances of a possible ceasefire?
Again, it's unclear, but if you look at probabilities and you look at logic and factor in those equations, just about an hour ago, Israel's national security advisor said that, no, there's no ceasefire in the works and we're not talking about it, but certainly it's in Israel's interest for there to be a ceasefire deal. And you know, there's a lot of public talk versus what's happening behind the scenes. It's in both sides' interests now, and certainly more pressure, I would say, on Israel at this point for there to be a ceasefire, because as the death toll mounts and as the images that we see come out of Gaza continue to come out, the international pressure, the pressure on Israel will grow as well. Now we understand that as of Monday, Gaza's going to run out of fuel. Because the cross points to get goods in and out, that includes medical, food, humanitarian, getting people out. People who come out of Gaza on a regular basis for dialysis or for cancer treatments who can't get out right now. And the crossings are being targeted. So no fuel going in means as of Monday they say they're going to run out. So the humanitarian issue is huge, and that's going to fall, the onus on that's going to fall on Israel as well.
We are by your side. That was the message from Italy's president to his Ukrainian counterpart, Volodymyr Zelensky, who's visiting Rome for talks with Italy's leaders. This is his first visit to the EU and NATO countries since the conflict with Russia began. Zelensky has been meeting Italian President Sergio Mattarella and Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. He's also meeting Pope Francis. Meanwhile, Russia has acknowledged its forces have withdrawn from positions north of Ukraine's city of Bakhmut after a new Ukrainian offensive. Moscow says its troops have moved to more advantageous defensive positions. However, the Wagner mercenary group called it a rout and not a regrouping. Well, CGTN's correspondent Shelby Wilder in Kyiv said President Zelensky is hoping to drum up support for Ukraine's counteroffensive.
Well, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is hoping to bolster support from Italy and Western allies with this trip, meeting with Italian government officials and also Pope Francis at the Vatican today. Now, President Zelensky tweeted as he was landing in Italy that this trip was, quote, important for the victory of Ukraine, end quote. As you mentioned, Jamie, this was his first trip to Italy since the conflict began. Italy has supported Ukraine throughout. And this visit was not announced in advance due to security concerns. But we know President Zelensky spent a significant amount of time with Italy's President Sergio Mattarella and also the Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni in Rome. President Zelensky is expected to head to Germany next, although there has been uncertainty around his visit to Berlin as his itinerary was leaked to the press in advance, which has had the Ukrainians very upset about this. But otherwise, the latest reports, Germany will be supplying Ukraine with additional military equipment. This will be totaling 2.7 billion euros. This is the largest amount that Germany will have supplied Ukraine with since the conflict began. We know that this will include combat vehicles, tanks, reconnaissance drones, anti-aircraft systems and ammunition, Jamie.
If these reports are confirmed, it looks like we're seeing the start of Kyiv's biggest offensive. What more can you tell us about the fighting?
So, in regards to what's happened here on the ground in Ukraine, Russia launched another wave of drone attacks across the country in the early hours of this morning. Russia launched 21 kamikaze drones. We heard Ukraine's military say that they shot down 17 of those, along with one Russian reconnaissance drone. Now, here in Kyiv, air raid sirens sounded out in the early hours of this morning. We know that all of the Iranian-made Shaheds that were directed at the capital were destroyed, but the 4 drones that managed to evade Ukraine's air defense did hit targets throughout the country. This included in the cities of Lviv, Nikopol, Khmelnytsky and Mykolaiv. And the latest figures we have is that at least 21 civilians have been wounded from these Russian drone strikes carried out across Ukraine in the early hours of this morning. And otherwise, from the front lines, we had been following the reports this week that Ukraine's military had been making gains in and around the embattled city of Bakhmut. Ukraine's military said they had gained up to 2 kilometers in some areas. Now, the Kremlin has tried to claim that this was a strategic withdrawal, that Russian forces have been pulling back to try and have the higher ground. But Ukraine's military is saying this is not true, and really they're just managing to carry out these successful counter-attacks in and around that city. We'd also heard the head of the private military group Wagner, Yevgeny Prigozhin, state this week that an entire Russian brigade had abandoned its positions in the south of Bakhmut. And today, the UK Defense Ministry confirmed this, saying that, quote, Russia has a severe shortage of credible combat units on the battlefield. Jamie.
Turkey's President Erdogan faces his toughest electoral challenge yet as the country heads to the polls on Sunday. This election is set to be one of the most consequential in Turkey's modern history. Erdogan, who's aiming for a 3rd consecutive term, has been holding his final rally in Istanbul. His main opposition challenger, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, held his final rally in Ankara on Friday. The opposition leader has edged ahead in some of the polls. CGTN's correspondent Mikhail Bardavid has been looking at the 2 main candidates and some of the issues in this campaign.
Turkey is heading to both parliamentary and presidential elections on Sunday. But the main question is, will Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan lose his throne after 2 decades in power? Erdogan faces his greatest challenge from a united 6-party opposition known as the Nation Alliance. 74-year-old Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, the leader of the main opposition Republican People's Party, has been appointed as their presidential candidate. For those who are supportive of Erdogan, his image is among key factors.
We give our support to whoever will serve the country and the nation the most. We need to stand against those who threaten our country and our soldiers, especially against the PKK.
I want to see a strong leader. I want to see a leader who not only represents me within the country, but also abroad. A leader that I can be proud of with all my might.
Meanwhile, for opposition supporters who back Kılıçdaroğlu, human rights and freedom of expression are among the key issues of concern.
I want a free country first and foremost, which means I want equality, where nobody interferes with others, whether you're religious or irreligious, whether you're open or covered. I don't want anyone seeing these things.
Analysts stress that for many of the voters during this election, a key factor is also going to be the economy. Inflation reached a peak level of 85.5 last October and has especially affected food prices, while the Turkish lira lost almost 60% of its value in the past 2 years.
Erdogan has focused on growth and has pledged to create 6 million jobs, while Kılıçdaroğlu promises to lower inflation and draw back foreign investors. While Erdogan is a more conservative leader and anti-LGBT, Kılıçdaroğlu is known to be more pro-Western and inclusive. The devastating earthquake in southeastern Turkey on February 6th that left over 50,000 people dead may also impact some voters come Sunday, as the government faced much criticism for its slow response. With the two top presidential contenders, Erdogan and Kılıçdaroğlu, offering voters contrasting visions for the future of Turkey, much is at stake here during the tight elections on Sunday. Michal Bardavit, CGTN, Istanbul.
A powerful storm is forecast to hit the Bangladesh-Myanmar border, prompting fears for the safety of more than 1 million refugees. Cyclone Mocha is expected to make landfall over the Cox's Bazar refugee camp on Sunday. People living in the area are seeking shelter as they prepare for winds of up to 175 kilometers an hour and 3.5-meter high sea surges. It's also expected to hit Myanmar's Rakhine state, where 6 million people are already in need of humanitarian aid. Snow has fallen in parts of northern Spain after months without any rain and high temperatures sweeping through the country. A freak snowfall occurred in the northwest mountainous area of Asturias. Meanwhile, hailstones and heavy rain also fell in eastern parts of the country, including Catalonia and Valencia. However, Spain has also recorded 11 hotter-than-normal days so far this year, more than twice the number that typically occur during a full year. The government has announced an emergency drought relief fund worth more than $2.4 billion to help areas and industries most affected by extreme water shortages. Our correspondent Ken Brown reports.
It's morning delivery time here in the small village of Torrelles de Foix outside Barcelona. Pere Formach is a local dairy farmer who drops off regular supplies of yogurt, cheese and milk to his customers. But his work has become much more challenging in recent years. The grain crop he grows to feed his livestock has withered due to severe drought.
I've never seen anything like this in my lifetime. In my 35 years in this industry, planting and farming, there's never been a situation where you plant and crops die because of such a drastic lack of water. We've already lost everything this month.
This part of northeastern Spain is one of the most severely affected regions in the country. There's been practically no rainfall in nearly 3 years, prompting the government to earmark urgent funds to help regions like this. Over $1.5 billion will be set aside to increase water supply through desalination plants and improve existing efficiency. More than $850 million in direct grants and loans will also be made available to help struggling farmers feed livestock and ensure water supply for crops. Normally, this grain field would be waist high at this time of year, but this crop has hardly got off the ground. This past April was the hottest and driest in Spain since records began, and that follows Spain's hottest ever year recorded last year. Experts are growing increasingly concerned.
What we can draw from this is a scenario where water resources become scarcer for a number of reasons: less rain, less snow in the mountains, and higher temperatures, which means more evaporation. As we have said, we are now seeing periods of drought that become not just longer, but more intense. In the coming decades, these periods will become more extended.
The government has categorized this drought as a major national concern and pledged to release funds as soon as possible.
I don't think they'll be able to help everyone who's suffering from this drought. Crop and livestock farmers, fruit and vegetable growers, it's absolutely everyone.
For Pere and other farmers on the front line of the drought emergency, that help may already be too late to rescue this season's harvest. Ken Brown, CGTN, Barcelona.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Thailand is holding presidential elections. We'll be looking at the issues on voters' minds as they head to the polls on Sunday.
Roger, Ricky, loud and clear.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Oh, no.
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
This week on Razor, the scientist using origami to fight antibacterial resistance. And saving eyesight using robots and stem cells.
It's as if you cut the human hair 10 times and then you need to go with one of those tools in between those layers while the patient is awake. And that's something that humans just cannot do. That's where robots come in.
Hello, welcome back. A reminder of our top stories. No truce in sight as 5 days of rocket fire between Israel and the Islamic Jihad in Gaza leaves at least 33 Palestinians and 1 Israeli dead. Our other headlines: Russia says it's withdrawn from areas around Bakhmut to gain defensive advantage. Meanwhile, Ukraine's president is in Rome for talks. And Turkey's on the eve of knife-edge elections as leaders make their final pitches before voting begins. And our correspondent Trent Murray is in Istanbul. Trent, what's your sense of how this election might go?
Well, I mean, Jamie, you can probably see behind me the sun is beginning to set there on the beautiful Bosphorus Strait, and I think the question that millions of Turks are asking right now is, could this be the last evening that President Erdogan is in power of this country? Certainly the polls would suggest it could be. It is an incredibly close race. His 74-year-old opponent, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, has led a very strong campaign. He's got that 6-party coalition behind him. They don't have much in common, those different parties, other than a desire to try and boot Erdogan out of office. But the incumbent is not going down without a fight. He has spent much of today doing what he does best, that retail politics, meeting folks on the street and in their homes, drinking tea, shaking hands, kissing babies, all that stuff politicians love to do on the eve of a campaign. And the real question, I think, is whether he'll be able to continue to hold on, not just to his base, but those undecided voters. As you would know, Jamie, you've reported extensively from this region. Turkish politics is not necessarily falls down the line between left and right. It's very much religious conservatives versus staunch secularists. Both sides have got their bases. It's that group in the middle that they are desperately fighting for, and that is what will decide, I think, the outcome come tomorrow evening when those votes get counted.
Trent, we all know about Turkey's struggling economy, but also that terrible earthquake. I wonder how the government's response to its aftermath might affect the voting.
Well, I think when you travel down to that region, and we were just down there a few days ago in Hatay and Marash, two of the cities that were most impacted by the quakes, what you get a sense of is that it has really shaken up the political landscape as well, for want of a better expression. And that is because you've got people who on one side feel like the government helped them a lot. They've been put in temporary housing and they are just ironclad Erdogan supporters without a shadow of a doubt. But then you've got other folks who feel like they've been left behind a bit. They might still be living in tents or still trying to get onto a waiting list for a home, and they do feel let down. And you get the sense that they will use tomorrow's vote in order to try and send a protest message to the government. When you speak to officials as well in both campaigns, what they will also say is that, look, pre-earthquake, we had a pretty good idea from polling of where there were strongholds of support for us, where we were weak in other areas, but the earthquake has just really turned all of that upside down, and it's very hard for them to gauge where the support is now, whether people have left the district for other parts of the country. And so there is one of the big unknowns going into tomorrow evening is how people in that region of central and southern Anatolia will vote, areas that largely were traditionally quite strong for Erdogan, but he could see a weakening of his support down there because of that disaster, which they call the disaster of the century.
Trent, interesting few hours ahead. Thank you for that. Our correspondent Trent Murray in Istanbul. Thailand is also holding its general election on Sunday. The opinion polls are predicting a big win for the populist Pheu Thai party, backed by the billionaire Shinawatra family. It would spell an end to a decade of governments led or backed by Thailand's royalist military. Rising living costs and household debt have been some of the key campaign issues. Our correspondent Dusita Salkau reports.
Under the scorching midday sun, lines form. It's out of desperation. This is Southeast Asia's second largest economy. The infrastructure proves it. But it's also one of Southeast Asia's most unequal, with one of the largest wealth gaps in the world. And that's the story these lines uphold. For the tens of millions of Thais trying to carve out a living, it's like living in a house of cards. At any moment, could all come crashing down. They were optimistic once, optimistic that after years of political instability, a new government will make things better. That leadership came to power 8 years ago under Prayut Chan-o-cha, promising to provide stability after long-running protests plagued the country's economy.
We all had hoped that the government would move the economy forward. Right now, to earn even $10 is difficult. Selling coffee for half a day, I can't even make that much. The economy is bad.
With the country facing increasing living costs and consistently high household debt, Thailand's economy is front and center in this up-and-coming election. As a result, this election is seeing a huge number of so-called populist policies, with political parties trying to woo voters with promises of higher wages, subsidies, to even cash handouts. Promises which could end up being a double-edged sword.
This kind of policy might lead to other types of issues. My concern is on how these short-term policies would address the structural issue that we really need to address. So structural reform that would allow younger generation to have a chance in moving up the economic ladder.
Because much of Thailand's divisive politics is increasingly marked by a generation war. A generation taking their frustrations to the streets, demanding reform of the country's political system. The majority here, born in the 1990s, have now experienced 3 economic crises, 2 military coups, and countless constitutional changes. But now, these people under 40 make up around 40% of Thailand's 52 million voters.
I worry about the future. There's a lot in the news about employment challenges. It's more competitive for us. We need to develop our skills. So I hope that for our future, this election brings change.
But change in this country has been hard to come by. And as the curtain closes on the current government, structural problems, an aging population, inequality, high household debt and declining export competitiveness are piling up. Dusita Salkau, CGTN, Bangkok, Thailand.
Mayan is one of the world's oldest languages, but instead of dying out, it's experiencing something of a revival thanks to modern tech in the shape of TikTok. Through his language tutorials, content creator Santos Tus has sparked interest from all over the world. Our correspondent Alistair Baverstock reports.
At the height of the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown in 2020, Santos Tus downloaded TikTok. Creating a profile, he selected education as one of his interests and quickly found an audience. People across his native Mexico and the wider world interested in learning his mother tongue, Mayan.
The number of Mayan speakers is reducing every year, and that has a lot to do with discrimination. But with my videos, I wanted to show people that this language is something for us to feel proud of.
3 years later, Santos has garnered an audience of more than 300,000, teaching an ancient language through the 21st century social media phenomenon.
I have had messages from people all over the world, from Spain, the US, Canada, France. It's a good educational platform to share art, science, and in my case, language. It reaches all ages, from kids, teenagers, adults, and older people.
At 58, Ana Maria Kawich is perhaps not your typical TikTok user. Nevertheless, the platform has helped her fill a gap she feels in her cultural identity.
Mi papá y mi mamá son mayeros. Hablan maya.
My parents spoke Mayan, but they never spoke to their children in that language. They spoke to us in Spanish. My desire is to learn to speak fluently, to be able to communicate with my own people.
She follows Santos on TikTok and says his videos are helping her where her own family could not.
TikTok
is a great tool to practice speaking. It feels like the person is present, so it helps me.
Learning Mayan through social media led Ana Maria to language classes at the Yucatan Mayan Cultural Institute, where director Eric Villanueva says the resurgence can bring enormous social benefits.
Estamos como en una etapa de transición porque vamos saliendo.
Not long ago, indigenous languages in Mexico were actively being eliminated. But a transition is happening towards their promotion and recognition. To teach Mayan is to teach people about their own indigenous culture, and we are seeing a rebirth of pride in their Mayan heritage among our young people.
As social media does its part to keep indigenous language alive, the cultural identity it fosters may bring native communities closer together. Alistair Baverstock, CGTN, Yucatan, Mexico.
The headlines again. No truce in sight as 5 days of rocket fire between Israel and the Islamic Jihad in Gaza leaves at least 33 Palestinians and 1 Israeli dead. Our other headlines, Russia says it's withdrawn from areas around Bakhmut to gain defensive advantage. Meanwhile, Ukraine's president is in Rome for talks. And Turkey on the eve of knife-edge elections as leaders make their final pitches before voting begins. And that is the world today. Thank you for watching. There's more news on CGTN Europe's channel, on the Telegram app, or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone. More news at the top of this hour. Coming up next, it's The Agenda with Juliet Mann. For now, from all of the team in London, it's goodbye.